The age-old question of EU versus NA, which one is better? Well, as so many things in life, it all depends on who you ask. Most people are biased in some way and others don't take this question seriously to begin with, just kind of making a joke of it. And honestly, we should probably do the latter. I'm not here to definitively answer this question by any means. All I want to do today is share my own experience playing on NA versus EU servers, what I liked and disliked about each queue and which one I ultimately prefer. So again, this is not so much me trying to say that what happened to me is what happened to everybody. There will be people making contrary experiences to my own, obviously. So if you experience something else from what I'm about to share, do feel free to sound off down in the comment section below. So I guess it would make the most sense to start with my EU experience since I am an EU player. And in that regard, I should probably address the elephant in the room, which is communication. If memes were to be believed, then players on EU don't communicate at all. Reason being the language barrier. When it comes to my own experience, there is a certain level of legitimacy to that, but nowhere near as drastic as others say. It is true that people I have played with talked less, but I never felt like I went through a majority of my games without any comms at all. It's more about players only communicating what they find necessary, mostly callouts on flankers and the like. In my games on EU, there was, on average, nowhere near as much strategizing and discussion happening as on NA. Which brings me to an interesting point. Even though people talk a lot on NA servers, they seem to be far less knowledgeable. Their communication seemed more based around asking their team for a collective opinion rather than suggesting something. So, where on EU players you'd have someone suggesting a swap from, let's say, Tracer to McCree to counter a Pharah, NA players would rather say something along the lines of, "This Pharah is killing us, what do we do?" At first, it just seemed like a less demanding way of suggesting to swap, but I quickly came to realize how much the people I played with depended on voice comms on NA. They seemed generally far less aware of their surroundings and far less experienced when it came to shutting down whatever the enemies are doing. Contrary to that, EU players are much faster on the draw to suggest swaps and hard counters without necessarily asking for anyone's opinion. And that does include asking whether or not the player in question is even any decent on said pick that was needed. So to summarize that bit, in my experience, NA players seem far more dependent on their teammates' input. However, their type of communication did include asking their team about possible swaps, making strong changes based on player skill more likely than on EU, where players usually don't question whether or not you are good on said hero that is required. What I felt during my time playing on both servers was that EU players were mechanically stronger. Due to the language barrier, players seem to try harder to improve on an individual level. The lack of input from their team does, however, cause a biased point of view on the match as a whole, where they pay less attention to what causes trouble for the entire team and just look at what counters them individually. NA's massive reliance on voice comms make them feel very clumsy at times. Did you just deflect that? What happened? This is your literal one. Very obvious mistakes were made when things weren't being called out, to an extent that almost felt like some players had their in-game sound muted. They would completely ignore enemies flanking a lot of times if nobody called it out on voice chat, even on characters with very distinctive sound like Roadhog. Chain makes a lot of noise next to his very footsteps. While obviously all the jokes about NAGM being more like EU Platinum are massively exaggerated, I personally did feel like there was a difference in mechanical skill in favor of EU. But it didn't feel like they're just naturally the better players, it's more of a necessity due to the language barrier. That does mean that while NA relies a lot on their communication, they usually adapt a more coherent playstyle as a unit. Funnily enough, I've seen NA players blame people for not being on voice chat for their losses in situations where EU players would think, me being on voice does not make you guys suck any less. Both regions have their own gameplay philosophy and it is really difficult for me to say which one is better. Yes, Overwatch is a team game, so playing together as a team is definitely good, but neglecting individual skill based on that just doesn't feel right to me. And to me, as an EU player, the amount of communication happening on NA was outright annoying. People might think that more communication is great, but not everything that's being communicated is necessarily important or relevant at all. There were times where I had trouble concentrating on my gameplay because people just wouldn't shut up. And a lot of times they talked about things that I thought players should know and do naturally. Apology, this video is a lot about communication because that is really the main difference to me when it comes to playing on NA versus EU. But let's talk gameplay now, because despite me saying that I feel EU has stronger players on an individual basis, there is something I like more about NA, and that is the absence of troll Smurf accounts. Now, there will be NA players telling me that they are everywhere, all over the games, and that may be, but here's my experience. On EU, I can easily play 3 games and run into 3 separate GM players smurfing in Masters on their Hanzo or Widow only accounts. Heck, I even had one game with 2 guys who were each a Widow and Hanzo smurf while the enemies had a Hanzo smurf of their own. Sure, a lot of plays were made on NA that I found extremely questionable. I've seen comps work that I didn't think should be working, and I've seen players make misplays that I didn't think were even possible in Masters. And that happened at a much higher rate on NA than EU. However, what happened to me much more frequently on EU was winning or losing games because somebody decided to throw. Now, I'm not just talking about someone not playing at the best of their capabilities. What I'm talking about is that while NA players, in my experience, got very tilted very quickly as soon as things went south, I've had more EU players that already came aggravated into my matches. And those players then decide to throw in this spawn already when they don't like someone's pick. It's lit, bro. Why are these guys throwing? Like, they were winning. Like, mad. She actually, like, put a telly or something here? Looks like it. It is really a sad state of affairs when you play 2 games on EU and lose both of them because of a smurf and a thrower respectively. And then the only reason you win your 3rd game is because the enemies had a smurf that decided to throw. That kind of shit rarely ever happened to me on NA. Sure, players made really dumb misplays that I would jokingly categorize as a throw, but when we're talking about legitimate fuck all of you I'm throwing kinds of players, those I run into on a regular on EU. So let's summarize my experiences and thoughts to wrap this up. EU players are very focused on their own performance. Due to the language barrier, they rely less on their team's input and pay more attention to the surroundings themselves. As a result, individual skill and game sense usually improve. However, EU players in my experience are far more likely to throw a game if something happens that they don't like. Along with that, I'm dealing with an absolutely massive amount of particularly Hanzo and Widow smurf accounts. Sadly, whether or not you have someone throwing on your team often decides the result of a match rather than which team was actually better. NA players rely a lot on voice chat. They are very likely to discuss everything that's going on, and there isn't a lot of dead air. While their communication often makes them superior team players, individual skill matters less. It truly comes down to which team is better as a whole than which team has a better individual player. However, more chat sadly does not mean more knowledge. I have often come across entire teams that were unable to deal with something out of the ordinary that the enemies were throwing at them. Those times in particular are where them discussing everything is very annoying. I often had people throw ideas around wildly without knowing at all what they're talking about. And that discussion then often turns into straight up fights. A big difference in attitude from my experience came down to EU players throwing matches very quickly, whereas NA players usually still try to win a game even if they are tilted and even when they have disputes amongst each other. However, I've also come to expect less from NA players. They seem to be generally worse than EU players, which is particularly infuriating if you watch live, as they make really dumb misplays that honestly shouldn't happen. For me personally, I can't take NA cues too seriously, which is a good thing, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way. Since I'm running 120 ping on NA, I know I'm putting myself at a disadvantage. Just knowing that makes me far less likely to get tilted. In the same vein, EU games are far more infuriating as a whole. You might come across players who are more skilled individually, but them being so prone to giving up on matches that are perfectly winnable is more annoying than any NA misplays I came across, because it takes away any last chance I had of being victorious. But it doesn't change the fact that I am an EU player and I play under the best possible conditions when on those servers. So ultimately, if I just want to play for fun and be amused, NA servers will probably be my first choice. However, if I want to try hard and really give it my all, there's still no question that EU would be where I go to do that. In addition to that, I feel more challenged playing on EU. I've had a lot of games on NA where I simply couldn't understand how I won or lost. Again, coming down to things like, how the fuck does this comp even remotely work? Or how on earth do you guys not know how to deal with that? Next to the old, do you guys even have your headphones plugged in and your monitors? Because there's no excuse for you falling for that kind of play. But at the end of the day, it's still more of a pick your poison kind of deal. Because it's either I deal with that or I slam my face on my desk over the 18th match that I lost because I had a Hanzo Smurf on my team whose impact was equivalent to him being AFK. But this is me done for the day as I talk about my experiences playing on NA versus EU servers. If you enjoyed the video, do let me know by dropping me a like on your way out. Subscribe if you want to see more, and hope to see you all next time. Messed
Can't
up.
you just frag?
I'm so
And
sorry.
why?
I'm so sorry.
I'm going soldier now.
It was actually kind of lit. No, I'm gonna lie. Professional griefer.